Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's your boy, the biggest drawl in MMA writing, piling up those Diddy stacks talking about Conor McGregor, Jack Slack. And unlike Diddy, anything you pay me, I don't have to pay half of it to Sting. You don't have to worry about accidentally funding the tantric movement or anything like that. Though I did consider buying a large fur coat and turning up to the MMA Awards the year I was nominated opposite Ariel, and then storming the stage to declare that Jack Slack is for the children. You find your humble podcaster sipping an unreasonably hot cup of tea, so I had to wait for that to get sort of lukewarm before I can finish it. And I suppose we're at sort of a loose end. I mean, there is an event this weekend, but there wasn't an event last weekend. So what I've been up to lately is just catching up on lesser events that I wanted to watch but didn't get around to. So I've been catching up on K1's Heavyweight Grand Prix and whatever their other tournament was. Both of which were held in the Saitama Super Arena. And looking down K1's list of events, I believe this is the first time they've returned to Saitama in years. If you know anything about K1, you know that they had massive financial problems. The sort of thing where $500,000 disappears from the company's assets and someone gets a new conservatory. That's always what happens. But yeah, that and Yakuza links. FEG, I believe it was FEG. Dream Stage was Pride. Whichever one ran K1 and Heroes, they had all kinds of financial trouble, sold them off to some equity firm or something like that. And basically that's how the UFC ended up buying all of K1's... I think Glory bought all of K1's old library, you know, the bits people cared about, Andy Hug, Peter Ayats, all that shit. And K1 Japan sort of trotted on its own, even though most of the best fighters, best kickboxers in the world, are either in Glory or Kunlun or... you know, they're just... Most top kickboxers are just travelling around fighting wherever at the moment, but K1 Japan's doing a really good job, actually. I was well impressed with this heavyweight tourney. Maybe their last few events have been jank. I know that the big names weren't in the heavyweight tournament, but I did enjoy it. And it seemed like there was a good-sized crowd there for Saitama. If K1 could make something of a comeback, that would be amazing. If I had both Glory and K1 to watch, I'd be very, very happy. Except if they were on the same weekend. Which is what we're going to have to face next weekend, I believe, when the Bellator tournament starts at the same time as UFC 220. So that is going to be... Not next weekend, the weekend after, but that is going to be a jam-packed weekend. In fact, next week's podcast is going to be jam-packed, because I hadn't planned to talk about either of those as a preview on this episode. But then, you know, you're probably not going to want to hear much about what happened at Stevens versus Choi. I can't believe Jeremy Stevens is still headlining events. So let's catch up on some news. Actually, before we do the news, I'll just a little bit about that K1 heavyweight tournament. Well worth watching. Mr. Cool, what's his name? Ibrahim something, Moroccan fighter. He goes... blasts through his first two opponents, throwing the right hand into their guard and then coming back with the left hook as they open up and catching them. And then his last round opponent, he cracks him again with this wide left hook, and then the opponent starts covering up and just waiting for a punch, and then snapping out his own left hook as fast as possible, and it puts, whatever his name is, Ibrahim Mr. Cool, into like a shell. He can't open up anymore, and that gives this guy a chance to work. And the other guy, the guy who won it, really good at backing people onto the ropes, and when he got them there, he'd go left hook to the liver, right low kick, or left hook to the head, right high kick, and those four in sequence, you know, doing them up and down, he could really hurt guys, and then he'd use a Myrtle Groenhart style skip knee up the middle to catch guys out. Couple of really good guys in that. I enjoyed it a lot. But Koichi was in it, and I last saw him at Glory 8 in Japan. I was live for that, and they trotted him out to lose to Jerome Labana, or the ghost of Jerome Labana. And he was awful then, and he's still awful now. That guy has not improved at all. They did show Kyotaro in the audience, though, of this K1 event, and I was like, oh wow, I wonder what he's doing. I bet he's retired. Looked at his record, he's still boxing. He had a boxing match the other day. I think he's undefeated as a boxer, which would be really interesting. I liked Kyotaro a lot. He was not always the funnest fighter in the world, but he really confused some guys with his awkward style, and he gave even Semi Schilt a good go, despite being way undersized. So anyway, let's do some news. What's happened since last time we spoke? Some guy on the Jackson Wink MMA Instagram tweeted out that Cyborg, something about Cyborg being a man immediately after Holly Holm lost. So a little bit of sour grapes there. Holly Holm's never bitter about these losses, even when Jerome Labana cheated and hit her after the bell in every round. But yeah, super bad look for Jackson Wink, and the guy who tweeted it was, or Instagrammed it, or whatever the fuck it is, one of the ones I don't use, but he ended up getting banned from future UFC events, which shows us that now the UFC is not okay with people calling Cyborg a man. 3-4 years ago, absolutely fine. But going on with that Cyborg thing, there's teasing the idea of Nunez versus Cyborg, which, I mean, would be decent fun. I mean, at least Holly Holm showed that Cyborg, when she's not fighting absolute nobodies or really undersized opponents, she's not the guaranteed finish that she was advertised as. You know, if you've got some decent ring craft and a decent chin, you can make her work. And Nunez, you know, she can take a shot and she can give a shot much better than Holly Holm. So, yeah, interesting enough, I suppose. Does tie up 2 titles at once, but they are women's titles, so, you know, there's not an awful lot of challenges floating around for either. You give them time to build up some others while you claim this is a super fight. What else happened? Vitor Belfort is teasing his retirement after this Uriah Hall fight at the weekend, which I suppose we're going to talk about today, but Vitor Belfort's always teasing his retirement. I don't know if he's coming to the end of a contract and wants more money, but then he'd be threatening to go to Bellator, I suppose. Who knows? I hope he does retire. I'm sick of him taking up spots on the main card. And then the last thing that was really interesting this week, or it might have happened last week, but I saw it this week, Jeff Nowitzki went on the Joe Rogan podcast and basically outed himself as working for the UFC to try and help fighters with their drug issues or USADA issues. I was never really clear on Jeff Nowitzki's position in the UFC or with the UFC or whatever. Hadn't really been paying attention, but the more he said, the more it seemed like he was their consultant and get people off the hook. Really bad. He publicly said, yeah, John Jones probably wasn't trying to cheat. And you're like, does this guy actually believe John Jones is just the unluckiest man alive? Yeah, bizarre, but, you know, they desperately want John Jones back because he can at least move some buys. Now, if you haven't been following what I've been up to this week, firstly, get on the Fight Primer, that'll tell you. We published the Slackies for 2017 on Vice Sports. The Slackies are my informal awards that I do each year. I try and do things that are a little bit more interesting than Fighter of the Year, Fight of the Year, things like that. Maybe we'll talk some more about those sort of categories on this show. But we do a Game Plan of the Year, the Technical Turnaround of the Year, Event of the Year, the But Why Award for Low Fight IQ, and the Breakout Technique of the Year. And I mean, it's a huge piece. I think it's about 4,000 words, so go check it out if you're into that. And it just sort of like, it's got links to every single fight that I looked at this year that's on there. But Game Plan of the Year went to Rose Namajunas against Ioana Jędrzejczyk. For why, go check that out, and the honourable mentions and stuff. I try and give that to people who fight a different fight to their usual fight and are perfectly matched up with their opponent, as opposed to someone who always fights that way and perfectly matches up against their opponent for that fight. For instance, Rafael Dos Anjos fought a very Rafael Dos Anjos fight against Robbie Lawler and won, but and it worked perfectly. But you know, it would have been interesting if Rafael Dos Anjos had like put on an outfighting performance against someone, and that was the perfect. You know what I mean? Someone who had to change what they do. And then the Technical Turnaround of the Year, which we found out this year. Looking back, I've awarded 3 up to this year. 2016, 2015, and 2014, every single one of the winners won a title this year. How cool is that? So 2014 it was TJ Dillashaw, 2015 it was Rose Namajunas, 2016 it was Max Holloway. This year we were going to give it to Robert Whittaker regardless, and we did, but he won a title and has just been made the proper champion too, so that's quite cool. The But Why Award for Bad Fight IQ went to Anthony Rumble Johnson for his bizarre choice to wrestle with Daniel Cormier. You know, and we're not talking about choice to wrestle as in like he got stuck in the clinch for long periods of time, but he would break out of the clinch and then he would dive back in for a leg. It was very strange. And then for Breakout Technique of the Year, rather than the low kick, which would have been obvious and I actually forgot about, I thought I'd already given one to it, I went for the Anaconda Choke, and it was more of a principle one, fluid front headlock play. For reasons that you can check out on Vice Sports. But while I was writing the article that I believe is going up today about Doo Ho Choi and Jeremy Stevens, I got to my usual rant about Jeremy Stephens being perhaps the most overrated knockout artist on the roster. In 25 fights with the UFC, he's knocked out 7 people, or scored 7 knockouts. And since that knockout that they love to replay 100 times, the uppercut against Rafael dos Anjos, which was 10 years ago, 2008 rather, since then he has knocked out 4 people. So we were saying, 28% of his fights, he knocks the opponent out. Is he one of the most overrated knockout finishers of all time? And I thought, let's ask the Slack extended universe. Let's ask the MMA fans online who is the most overrated finisher in MMA. And I thought we'll do a lifetime achievement Slacky for overrated finisher. And this isn't like a mean-spirited thing. Obviously, there's a difference between having knockout power or, wicked submissions or whatever, and being a good finisher. A finisher, let's put it this way. I mean, the whole thing started with Jeremy Stephens saying that when he knocks guys out, they don't fucking move, and Conor McGregor's not a real knockout artist like that. But Conor McGregor, I reckon if you matched up each of their strikes and measured them on the machine, I reckon Jeremy Stephens would come out with more units in almost all of his strikes. But the thing is that Jeremy Stephens doesn't apply the pressure like Conor McGregor does. He doesn't force the openings like Conor McGregor does. And a lot of what Conor McGregor does is pressure, getting in the dude's face, kicking him in the body, tiring him out, and making him lash out clumsily so that he can score a perfect counterpunch. And then when he has someone hurt, he'll keep the pressure on without going wild and getting tied up. Jeremy Stephens probably has bigger hitting power in almost all of his techniques. He just doesn't have any of that pressure. He doesn't have any really slick counters that he looks for. He's just a big banger who's swinging to knock the guy out on every punch as opposed to looking for the perfect opportunity while picking away at his opponent. There's no... some of his more recent fights he's been doing a better job of it, but there's no like changing of dynamic. It's not like here's a couple of half power shots and then a big power shot, none of that stuff. And overwhelmingly what you'll see with Jeremy Stephens is that he does his best work against guys who aren't moving, or like Gilbert Melendez after he'd kneecapped him, couldn't move. Then he fights Renato Moicasa, whoever he is, the lanky guy. Stephens is number 5 ranked featherweight in the UFC. Moicasa is not ranked, and Moicasa just dances around him because he can't cut the ring, doesn't know what to do with his feet, So turning to the MMA sphere to find out who they believe is the worst or the most overrated finisher of all time. Some people took this to be a finisher who is overrated as a fighter. No, overrated in their finishing ability is what I meant. First one is a yo mama joke, always good. Anthony Pettis. Ooh. Someone was saying to me the other day that they were just as sick of seeing the Showtime kick as they are of seeing that uppercut, that Stephens uppercut against RDA. Do something more recent so that we could advertise that. Pettis, I don't know. One of his last 2 recent victories was a finish, and he was battering Jim Miller. And then before that, he had 4 out of 5 victories in a row finish. I think, obviously he's losing a lot nowadays. But I wouldn't call him an underrated finisher. He tends to get guys out of there with like a head kick or a submission. So it tends to be fairly quick. He's not a guy who has to put on a ton of pressure or anything like that. He's not a very systematic finisher. But he doesn't seem to get in trouble when he's got a guy hurt. And actually, then against Jim Miller, he did have him hurt at several points and did maybe. Mike Perry, I wouldn't really know how to rate his finishing abilities until I see him hurt someone decent. He's really very quickly come up against the big boys of the division. And yeah, not really ready to judge on him. Lots of people saying Jeremy Stephens, obviously. Anyone with the nickname One Punch or Hands of Stone isn't sleeping a lot of guys on the regular. I believe that Brad Pickett's was actually a misnomer or a name, an ironically given name? I don't know. Basically, the story goes, as I've heard it, that Pickett was always like a good wrestler. You know, he was always going on about British wrestling and this, that, and the other. But he was more of a grappler, and they put his nickname down as One Punch so that people would be worried about standing with him. Maybe it worked on the regional scene. Later on, he did develop some power, but he was never a very good striker. And yeah, got knocked out a lot. But yeah, I think that's one of those names where you do it to throw people off. Which reminds me of the story of Valid Ismail's first tournament. He went around talking to people, and he only knew how to pass the guard. He didn't have any takedowns, so he went around going, "Have you heard about this Walid Ismail guy? Oh, he's an amazing judoka." And then everyone he met in the tournament pulled guard against him. Yeah, Walid Ismail's crazy. Rousey, she did finish everyone she fought who, you know, didn't beat her. Johnny Hendricks, yeah, I think nowadays definitely an overrated finisher. I mean, he had one punch power and that amazing speed to get across the mat, but it's really atrophied since USADA and the IV ban. I think whenever you're talking about like a one-hit finisher, you don't always get to see how good they are at following up if the referee doesn't step in. That's part of the genius of Mark Hunt. As soon as he knocks someone down, he does the walk away, and the referee goes, well, you know, the other guy isn't already on his leg while he's over there, so he must be done. Mark Hunt saves himself a lot of trouble that he would have if he jumped in and started hitting a guy on the ground and the guy was fine and pulled him into guard. Overeem, to which I pointed out he's got a finishing rate of about 88% and finished about 81% of his fights, or losses rather. Yeah, so he is. You don't get many decisions with Overeem either way. Henan Barrow, I mean, that's partly because he fights or fought an awful lot of jobbers. Rampage, that's a good one. Rampage hasn't finished a fight since like 2008. Let's have a look. Ooh, 16 knockouts in almost 40 wins. Yeah, not really knocking a lot of dudes out. Less than 50% of his wins. Last time he knocked someone out, Christopher Mpumbu, whoever the hell he is, in 2014. And Joey Beltran, also a bit of in 2013. And before that, yes, literally 2008 against washed up Wanderlei Silva. Yes, Quinton Jackson, especially in this decade, has been a very overrated finisher. But then I think that a lot of that is getting carried away with the one punch. Rampage's whole game back in the day. I mean, I think the first Chuck fight was one of his best showings because his whole thing was dragging guys down and beating them up on the ground. But he'd cover up and swing, he'd use the crazy monkey style to cover and return fire on the feet. And that's how he got his clinches and his takedowns. But he'd hit guys hard in the head and body on the way. Oh yeah, someone said, a couple of people have said Hands of Stone now. So we're talking about Sam Stout and John Lineker. John Lineker surprised me. 13 knockouts in 30 wins, so 43% knockout percentage. 4% submissions, obviously those guillotines, and then 40% decisions. Yeah, it really doesn't knock an awful lot of people out. Sam Stout, 20 wins, 9 by knockout. So yeah, just under half. Again, not great. If you're being advertised as Hands of Stone, at least. Someone said Condit. That's a strange pick. 30 wins, 15 by knockout, 13 by submission. That's a very good finisher. I wouldn't call him a knockout artist, but he's only had 2 wins by decision. I consider Carlos Condit something of an opportunist. He'll grab a neck or throw up a triangle or whatever is there. Or, if you give him an opportunity, he'll hit you hard once and then try and get the finish off that. I wouldn't call him a very systematic, pressure finisher or anything like that, but he has a lot of finishes to his name, and you can't argue with the results, I suppose. I'm going to assume that was ironic, actually. People seem to be liking that. Loads of people saying Hendricks. Holly Holm, yes. I mean, most of her finishes are over... Well, her finishes are over Scrubs and Ronda Rousey, and that's it. She's got the weirdest record in MMA history. Hector Lombard, yes, he did have a big drop... Well, I don't know if it was a big drop-off in finishing rate, but he certainly had a big drop-off in ability after he left Bellator and his capped delts disappeared. Let's have a look. So, 19 in 34 wins by knockout, but 2 out of 4 of his wins since joining the UFC in 2012 have been knockouts, and the rest is him getting beaten up, basically. The overturned decision against Josh Berkman. Yeah, I mean, he's just not as scary against good fighters. I think that's the secret. He's got a very short reach, doesn't have very effective means of getting in other than sprinting at you. Yeah, well, Northcutt, I can't remember Northcutt's finishing rate, but I don't think anyone's advertised him as a knockout artist or a great finisher. Khabib, I've got an interesting question about Khabib in the mail sack this week, which we're going to be looking at. We're going to be doing a good few questions this week because it's a slow week. Pretty common knowledge at this point, but Andrei Arlovski, that's an interesting one. Given that he's known for having God's own right hand, 17 knockouts and 26 wins, that's pretty good. But, yeah, I think it just stands out how bad his victories are when he gets the decision. They're just very, very slow. But again, he's such a one-handed fighter that he doesn't get the opportunity to follow up very well on his knockdowns and things like that. He has to sort of rely on either hitting them multiple times with the right hand or them going down off the first and not getting up. Leonard Garcia, someone said, which is absolutely perfect because they were advertising him as a knockout artist for ages, especially after he knocked out Jens Pulver, who was chinny as fuck by that point. But I do recall him saying, after the Jens Pulver fight, yeah, I'm the hardest I train with welterweights and they say I'm the hardest puncher they've ever met at featherweight or whatever. He did knock out Hiroyuki Takaya just before that, I remember that now. 2 knockouts since then, but that was back in 2008, there you go. And his numbers are just incredible. Listen to this. 32 matches, 18 wins, 5 knockouts. So the way he fought, he did fight like he wanted to knock everyone out. He swung really hard all the time. But it just shows that doesn't work against decent fighters or even people who can recognize patterns, He swung as hard as he could in 32 fights and knocked out 5 people. Tells you what you need to know, really. Hitting hard and finishing are very, very different arts. Gray Maynard's always one of my go-tos to explain that. I mean, he hit really hard. But if you were telling friends, oh yeah, but he's got to be careful if he's fighting Gray Maynard, because Gray Maynard hits really hard, they'd go, I'm looking at Gray Maynard's record, and he's never knocked anyone out, except himself. He was a guy who could really hurt you with a punch, but didn't really know how to follow up on it and finish. Someone here wrote, Lyoto Machida, I think he got a lot better in more recent years, even though he's now way on the downward slope. But he's a very good example of being able to get knockdowns but not finishes. I think he has the most knockdowns in UFC history, or is close to the top. But for a very long time he couldn't finish people. Because finishing is an aggressive skill, and if you're a very gifted counterpuncher and a very conservative counterpuncher, that's not your wheelhouse. So you might get the big one-punch connections, but you then have to follow it up and you have to change gears, go forward, apply pressure. That's really one of the big differences between, say, Lyoto Machida and Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva hated leading. Lyoto Machida was a little bit more comfortable leading with a single kick and sharpshooting and stuff like that. But when Lyoto Machida got people hurt, he just went back to doing what he normally did, whereas when Anderson Silva got people hurt, he would really push that advantage. Anyway, I think the Lifetime Achievement Award for Slacky for Most Overrated Finisher either goes to Rampage because of the way that he's advertised now and the massive decline that he's had, not really doing much since 2008, or Jeremy Stevens because he was never really a big finisher and he's still advertised as one. Right, let's do some questions, because, there's fuck all going on last week, and the event this weekend's not good either, so let's talk about what you guys want to talk about. Good day to you, Jack Slack. This one's a cheeky two-parter. I am a big fan of your Wushu Watch series, and of martial arts frauds, charlatans, and pretenders. Do you have a favourite? If so, please discuss. Part 2. Would you ever do a series where you broke down and added cheeky British commentary to audience member fight videos? I myself am a fighter and would love the exposure as well as the laugh and a pointer or two. Your boy forever, Stefan. I don't want to say yes and get inundated by fight videos that I then don't watch. But I think I'll consider doing some stuff like that in future. Yeah, I quite like looking at people's fight videos. I'm getting so into looking at prospects and stuff now that, yeah, it would be interesting. But But returning to part one of the question, big fan of Wushu Watch and of martial arts fraud, charlatans and pretenders. Do you have a favourite? If so, please discuss. I mean, George Dillman is always going to be one of my absolute favourites, partly because it's just so ridiculous what he's selling, but also he was quite an important part of karate becoming so mainstream to begin with. Very peculiar. Well, this is something you find. Guys got into traditional martial arts because they wanted to fight, and then the older they got, the more they got into like the esoteric bullshit when they couldn't really fight anymore. And you're seeing some of that with like the mysticism of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu now. Guys being like, oh no, it's all about self-defense. You've got to teach the self-defense curriculum, which is, 1940s basic hip throw and in answer to being loosely grabbed around the neck or something like that. But obviously George Dillman, big mover in the Kyushu pressure point movement. One of the important guys in bringing like the Babishi to light and stuff like that. The Babishi is something that I really enjoy looking at and researching. It's a very old Chinese martial arts text which became very important in Okinawa where karate was, where Chinese martial arts became karate, or Tode, or whatever you want to call it. But, of course, like, it's full of interesting stuff, but it's also full of potions and chi meridian bollocks. So he basically focused on the chi meridian stuff. I mean, I've done a few things on Kyushu and George Dillman. Evan Pantazzi is also a massive hack. In fact, got to write one of the forewords for the new Babishi. I'd have done that, but, I'm not a pressure point hack, so they probably didn't want me. I did threaten to do Evan Pantazzi's Kyushu points for sex. I've watched it, it's awful, but the copy that I procured was in Spanish, so it didn't really help. But it's just this girl with her knockers out and a guy in like Y-fronts, and then they're embracing, and Evan Pantazzi walks on in a mustard sweatshirt and starts pointing at them like, this is a chi point, that'll be good for your sex. It's absolutely bizarre. I did write one called like a concession to the men in black pajamas, which was just talking about, there are points on the body you should be aiming for. The jaw, the temple, the eye. The idea of what Funakoshi called vital points as opposed to like pressure points, because you're always skirting on the edge of this dim max shit. In the Babushi, there's like, touch this point between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. and he'll die. And you're like, well, is that to the minute? Is it done on a lunar cycle, a solar cycle? Is it done on when he may have had his lunch? But, reading like Funakoshi's diagrams and stuff, it's just kick him here, it'll hurt. Or punch him in the floating rib and you might be able to fracture it because it's quite small and loose. Other stuff I did. Oh god, that Wing Chun guy who is like Wing Chun anti-grappling. That was fucking amazing. He had the guy Americana him from inside his guard and then goes, look, I just take his back. And you're watching it going, yeah, that's what happens if a guy tries to Americana you inside the guard. I don't know who is trying to do this. But Fedor's book, which is good, I often talk about it, and Connor and Pat from Heavy Hands the other day, they were talking about what a good book it is for like ground and pound stuff. But one of the moves in it is like, if the guy tries to Americana me from inside my guard, I take his back. And you're like, no one's ever done this. Why are you teaching this to me, Fedor Emelianenko? But then Fedor was a very strange style of grappling anyway. He would, from the bottom of mountain, he does this against Ricardo Arona, which is even weirder. From the bottom of mountain, he'd try and Americana guys and then buck and roll them over. Again, watch that Arona fight. It's truly bizarre. But this Wing Chun guy was just fucking amazing. He was so into being like, this is the anti-grappling. And anytime you hear anti-grappling, it's like anti-boxing or anti-anything. The best way to learn to deal with it is to learn what it entails to begin with. And you do that by training with boxers and people like that, or grapplers. Other great wushu watches. Oh, Master Halem or Ralem, that was great. This guy who wears blue camouflage. Like he wears camo all the time and does tons of gun disarms and shit, which seems to be a very strange fetish that some martial artists develop. I was watching a guy who claimed to have like the world's fastest gun disarm, and you're like, well, that's never going to be any use to you, because anyone who is showing you the gun. Anyway, the whole gun disarm thing is bizarre anyway. I mean, the principle generally is confront a gun, flee a knife. Because if you wrestle with a guy with a gun, yeah, you might burn your fingers or get them blown off, but the bullet is only going to go out the barrel of the gun. Whereas a knife, you try and wrestle with that, every direction he can try and cut you up in. Well, mainly the bladed direction, but he's going to fuck up your wrists and shit. But Master Halem is absolutely amazing. He's doing like Hurricane Ranas and head scissor takeovers and shit. It's basically... It's watching a man roleplay. That's what it is. He's just... And that's a lot of this combative stuff. And there are a lot of guys out there who are giving useful information. You know, who do I like? McCann. Jeff Thompson's stuff I've always enjoyed, you know. But there's only so many ways you can repackage simple punching, fleeing as fast as you can, understanding the situations that you should try and avoid so that you don't get mugged or held at gunpoint or whatever. Whereas there's this like group of people who enjoy wearing camo and calling their art combatives, and they always have a gut. And, you know, they're just obsessed with like showing you 90 different ways to take a gun off a guy if he stood with the gun pressed against your chest. And it's just fantasy. You're playing fantasy. It's never going to help you in the real world. If you are held at gunpoint by someone who is stupid enough to bring the gun close enough for you to grab, you know, most of it is going to be instinctual. You don't need to know exactly how to turn the gun out of his hand, and you're wasting your time learning 90 different methods of trapping the gun between your legs as you jump at him. But Master Halem is like the epitome of that. And watching him apply submissions is amazing. He doesn't know anything, and he'll just squeeze his opponent's leg as hard as he can, and eventually they'll tap out. Absolutely brilliant. I did one about swords and nunchucks a while ago, I think, just about neckbeards. There's this great book called The Street Katana or something like that, and it's about like using a katana for self-defense. And the cover has a guy with a beard in a trench coat holding this katana. And you're like, that's exactly what I pictured when I saw that title. I mean, we've also done stuff on like multiple man MMA in Russia and things like that. Multiple man MMA, there is no interest in it because, well, there shouldn't be any interest in it because once you've seen 2 bouts, you know exactly how it's going to go. The first man who gets eliminated has lost his team the fight, because as soon as one man is free, everyone else is tied up in a grappling exchange of some kind, and he can run over and start kicking the guy who's not on his team in the head. Just awful. I've never done anything on Ashita Kim, and I've always wanted to do something on Ashita Kim. But we're getting carried away. I will bring back Wushu Watch. I don't know if... I've not tried selling it to Vice recently, actually. Since the rebrand, I've been quite restrictive on what I take to Vice, but yeah, I'll ask them if they want Wushu Watch, otherwise I'll just do it on the Fight Primer. I'm constantly looking at Bullshido and things like that. I've got a huge collection of shit that I would love to talk about at some point. But yes, thanks, Stefan. On to the next question. Hey Jack, the incompetence of MMA judges at observing fights is well discussed, but the aspect of that which is never brought up is that watching fighting is a skill that's arguably more important than just training martial arts for judging a fight. What's your technique for watching a fight? Where do you look, and how do you take in the feints, counters, reactions, and a fighter's observations of all the little things as a fight happens? How can I improve my fight watching at home? Thanks for your time. I look forward to hearing more from you. I don't really have a technique. My main thing that I always say is that I like to watch the fights in a small window on my computer, because I like to see the whole everything. I like to see what their feet are doing and this, that, and the other. Where, you know, if you've got a 30, 40, 50-inch TV, unless you sit a long way from it, it's not going to help you take the whole fight in. The judges at events get monitors. I don't know how big the monitors are. I've sat behind judges but never really seen their monitors. Well, at the UFC events, at least, they get monitors. I think you just have to watch... I think I heard Pat Wyman say the same thing, actually, the other day, but watch between the fighters and try and take in the whole picture. You don't want to be watching one fighter because you'll get carried away with it, and you're watching for what they do until it becomes very obvious that they're getting hit a lot, and you should be watching the other, or you should be taking note of what the other guy is doing. As far as like how I pick up on things, it's just having watched lots of fights and watched lots of fights lots of times. You start taking these things in by going back over fights you've already seen and going, oh, that's interesting, actually, I didn't notice that. And then, the more practiced you get at that, the more you take in on the first time you're watching it. Hi Jack, you've often mentioned just how beneficial feints can be, e.g. the boxing up of Anderson Silva, oh yes, t-shirts coming soon. But what would the best counter to a fighter who uses prolific feints? What would the best counter be to a fighter who prolifically uses feints? And what other drawbacks are there to feinting? I wish you all the best with your work, from Matt. The thing about feinting is that you're not giving them anything. The whole idea of a feint is that you get the reaction without giving them the thing that they want to counter or work against. Feinting done well, the great thing about it is that there aren't any counters to feinting. You can't punish someone for feinting. The downside is that if your feints aren't convincing, like if you feint too much or if they don't look enough like your actual strikes, you're not fooling anyone. You're getting diminishing returns every time you do it. So you have to, for every feint I could stand in front of Mark Hunt and feint at him, and I'd feel very comfortable because I'm not getting close enough. I'm not stepping in and opening up to get hit by Mark Hunt. But the only way that feints are actually going to work is if you step in and hit him every few times that you do the feint. If I feint at Mark Hunt once and he flinches, and then I feint at him again and he flinches, and then I keep feinting at him and not throwing stuff, he's going to realise, walk in on me and beat the shit out of me. Yeah? So you have to have the legitimate... the guts to step in. You have to be able to step in. Like, guys tend to only go to feints if they're worried, if they're not a very good fighter, that is. If they're not a very technically good fighter, they'll go to feints when they're worried about stepping in, and then they'll stop stepping in. The way that feints work is that they only have that great effect if there's the danger of you actually hitting the opponent. So you've got to find something fast that you can get in comfortably and then mix it in with feints that look like that. You can't have like a really fast right low kick and keep feinting the jab and then right low kick. You've got to feint the low kick and then low kick, or feint the jab and then jab. In terms of dealing with feints, you just have to try and get a better hold of what the opponent's doing, and try and make situations where they will have to throw legitimately so that you can counterpunch. So again, like, pressuring to the fence is a situation where you put them in a situation where feinting is not to their advantage. If they are losing ground rapidly, about to hit the fence, there's no point in trying to fake you out. They will try and hit you properly, or they won't, and you just step in on them. Dear Jack, in Khabib Nurmagomedov's last 2 fights, he administered some of the most thorough ground and pound I've seen in some time. How he didn't get the KO or TKO on either Barboza or Johnson. What does this indicate to you? Oh, however he didn't get the TKO. Yeah. What does this indicate to you? Is it a matter of ground and pound producing mostly tissue damage, like cuts, hematomas, fractures, and less concussive damage? Or does it indicate a weakness in Khabib's finishing ability? Thanks for your thoughts, Holden. Well, he did finish Johnson. He claimed he could finish Barboza, but chose not to. Don't know how much stock I put in that. I don't really put any stock in anyone saying that they could have finished but didn't. You're like, did you not want the bonus? Did you not want the far better advertising for your ability that you'd have from that? But the thing about ground and pound generally is I'd like to consider it in 2 types. There's static ground and pound and dynamic ground and pound. And dynamic ground and pound is ground and pound while moving. And you'll see Khabib do... Well, the best guys, you see them do both. But static ground and pound is where you are holding the opponent in position and hitting them. And when you are holding an opponent in position, you're locked to them, so you don't have the freedom to move your hips and your shoulders and everything as freely as you could. You're not being able to transfer weight into the shots. Dynamic ground and pound is, stand over. If you get knee on belly and you stand to like drop a punch on someone, you'll probably lose position. They'll fight back to guard, but you've got a good chance of landing a really good heavy strike. The best example of dynamic ground and pound, and where a lot of ground and pound knockouts come is the throw by pass to the overhand. Everyone's seen it, everyone knows it, but it is easily the most powerful ground and pound punch you can think of, because you are performing basically a standing falling punch, all your weight's in it, and you're in motion while you're doing it. Whereas a lot of what Khabib does is like when he grapevined the guy's legs along the fence, and then he'll start throwing those uppercuts. It was impressive that you can throw uppercuts from there. I learned something new. But, his legs are locked to the guy. He's using his hips to hold the guy down. There were some really nice ones in the Johnson fight. The really big hurting punches, he stood up over Johnson and punched down on him. But a lot of it is like trapping the guy's wrist to him and then hitting him with the free hand while holding him down. You're going to mark him up. You're going to tire him out. It's going to hurt and damage him. But you're probably not going to knock him unconscious because you don't have enough room to build up momentum, and you also aren't using your whole body weight in it. It's just a trade-off. I mean, maybe, like, obviously, like a Brock Lesnar or someone like that, they can concuss people with arm punches, but it's very, very rare. I could see guys getting hit at the wrong time and going out, but the thing about Barboza and Johnson is once you're on top of them, they know that you're going to be hitting them the entire time. You're not going to catch them off guard or anything like that, which is part of the advantage of hitting people on the feet. You're catching them when they thought they were safe. Right, quick plug, and then we'll get back to some more questions. If you haven't signed up to the Patreon, the Customato episode is the tits. I would highly recommend... Well, it's really the Floyd Patterson and Customato episode, but I would highly recommend getting on that. This month we're going to be doing the Pride... Is it 2005 Grand Prix? The one that Shogun... Well, I won't spoil it for you if you haven't heard. Shogun's pretty good, or was back in 2005. But that's our next one, the second Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. If you haven't bookmarked the Fight Primer, go do that. I am now doing Prospect Watch there. The first Prospect Watch is Jack Slack's Prospect Watch. My mistake, sorry. Is it Akhmed Aliyev, and he is the guy who had that really weird stoppage against Diego Brandao a little while ago. But he's the highest ranked lightweight prospect outside the UFC by Fight Matrix, and he's fairly high ranked by like Ranking MMA and Tapology and places like that. And he's just a really interesting striker who I thought, why not start with an interesting striker? So we're going to be doing way more of those. I'm doing more scouting, I'm doing more hypothetical matchmaking, and I really think you'll enjoy it. If you don't know who he is, take that as a good thing. Go find out who he is. He's interesting. So fightprimer.com. And if you haven't bought Notorious, give me that Diddy money. Hi Jack, huge fan of your work. I have a question regarding circling in an open guard situation. Quick explanation, open guard is southpaw versus orthodox. Logically speaking, it seems the southpaw fighter is always better circling to the right, away from his opponent's powerful right hand, but when I watched Holly Holm versus Cyborg and Pacquiao versus Mayweather, they often circle to the left towards the opponent's power hand. Could you please explain to me why? Thanks, from Evan. Again, when we're talking southpaw versus orthodox, there's been, firstly, a ton of... It's grown a lot in importance since like the early days of boxing, when the simple circle past the lead foot, throw the right hand was the go-to thing against southpaws. If you're fighting, a fairly basic southpaw, or frankly, if you are a southpaw and you're good at it, that's still enough. Luis Barnya Kane was like approaching the light heavyweight top 10 at one point in the UFC, basically just checking the lead hand, stepping outside the lead foot, and throwing his left hand down the centre. And then he fought Little Nog, and I think Little Nog boxed him up. Yeah, he boxed him up. But yeah, there's a lot of different angles at play, and the more comfortable that the world has got with having southpaws, because southpaws, it used to be that you didn't get a lot of southpaws because boxing coaches would only teach orthodox, and then even as guys started to go southpaw, it was so unfamiliar that it often made for like a boring, ugly fight. So promoters and managers would be reluctant to take on southpaws or match southpaws against orthodox fighters. So for a long time, they had a very hard time in boxing getting fights. However, over the last 50, 60 years, well, Lou Tendler was like a southpaw back in the 20s, and he got a world title shot at Benny Leonard, and he knocked a load of Leonard's teeth out. But that was like a real exception that he did so well. But only really very recently, southpaws have started to become more of a commonplace in boxing. Very recently, in terms of like it's a 200-300-year-old sport. But now you're seeing that there are a lot more interesting angles and setups there than was originally taught. Pacquiao obviously has a great right hook, which Freddie Roach put in so much time building. But I think I did a piece on Manny Pacquiao called like Manny Pacquiao, the savior of boxing or some shit like that. One of those titles is going to piss off a load of people. But we talked about like the basics of angles and how they affect punches. So Pacquiao, he'll do the classical step outside the lead foot slightly to the, he's a southpaw, so he'll step slightly to the opponent's right outside the lead foot, line up his left shoulder and shoot a left straight down the center at his opponent's chin, and that's shortening the left hand. But he also, like against Hatton and against loads of other people, he'll step out to his left side and either throw the overhand or the hook or a left straight from like an angle, and that's lengthened the left hand, but he has changed the angle through which it comes through the guard. So you're seeing in MMA a lot now, this like shooting through the open side. Guys will circle towards the open side, let the opponent fall short with a punch, and then try and crack him through the wake of it on that side. Or just circle to the open side and try and hit behind the opponent's guard. Because when you're working on the open side, you aren't working against their back and shoulder, which is what will save them from a lot of punishment. You're working against just their rear hand, really. And their reactions, obviously. Actually, Benny Leonard did that same open guard counter against Lou Tendler way back in the day. It's one of the only Leonard fights. I think it might be he came back way later as like a fat old man, but it's one of the few like prime Leonard fights we have footage of, and I put it up on Reddit MMA. I think people loved it. But yeah, the exact same counter that you see from like Wonderboy Thompson, Conor McGregor, all these guys who like an open stance and like to retreat to that open side and throw the rear hand through. And of course it works the other way. If you want to throw your right hook, you move to the right, you come around the guard, but it's a longer punch because it goes wider around the outside of the opponent. You move to your left, you can bring the right hand straight up the center, like, say, Tyson when he used to shift off into a southpaw stance. It's a shorter punch. And so on. The directions you move in have effects on your punch. And this is what I was saying about Holly Holm the other week, in the Cyborg fight, in fact. She threw the left hand every time, and she threw it exactly the same way. I wanted more variety, but variety doesn't mean throw 2 hook kicks, Holly, which is what she did. Variety means circle a different way. Throw that left hand from somewhere different, or do something different after the left hand, follow it with the right hand, duck in, fake a clinch, come out with the right hand, fake a clinch, come out with the left hand, duck in, push her away, high kicker. There's so many things you can do just with the basics. The thing that I've always loved saying is, it's not the techniques, it's the stuff that happens between them that makes a fighter special, or really dictates the fight. So yeah, there are advantages to circling both ways, and really once you're competent defensively, if you're not terrified of this guy's right hand or left hand or whatever he is, we'll say you're going against a southpaw. So if you're not terrified of his left straight, and you're confident dealing with it because you've worked against some southpaws in the gym, because we live in the modern world, you can circle both ways looking for where you can get off your punches and your counters. Really, like, the circle away from their rear hand is for people who are... Well, the southpaw did used to be this guy with a big left hand who was just terrifying. That was the whole thing. They were guys who were left-handed and refused to learn to box orthodox, which is how almost every coach taught it. So they mainly just wanted to hit you with their power hand, which came from a weird angle. Anyway, cheers, Evan. Hi Jack, hope you're doing well. If you read this on air, please be sure to skip over any of the silly parts. Also, my own voice is a New York accent. Oh, hang on. New York. Oh no, I can't do a New York accent. Fuck. I was working on my Scouser for ages, but then Darren Till apparently read some of my articles, so I didn't want to risk doing my Scouse accent on the show. But anyway, so hopefully when you read it out loud, it doesn't sound like it's coming from a dock worker. Okay. You've done extensive writing on MMA and fighting. What's your experience like working with editors, either at a professional setting, i.e. Fightland, or your own personal editor, if you have one? I'm an editor for an academic press, and wondering if there's an avenue for freelance editing for MMA writers. If you do have any advice on the editing side of MMA writing or finding potential writers, ? Thanks for your thoughts. Best, Andrew. P.S. Here's a picture of George St. Pierre as Georges Carpentier. I thought it was an obscure reference that you'd enjoy. I love it. If you want to see that, I think I'll put it on the thumbnail for this episode. It's great. It's basically the cover of Georges Carpentier's book, which is actually really underrated, and I love it. So thank you for that, Andrew. That's the best laugh I have had all week. In regard to editing, I'm maybe not the man to ask because I don't proofread very well a lot of the time, but or bother. But yeah, I've always enjoyed. I think I've enjoyed most of my editors. The only time that I didn't enjoy was, if they're listening now, all my editors now worrying. No, Fightland's editor was great. Bloody Elbow's editor was great. The Brian, who I worked with at Bleacher Report, was great. But Bleacher Report has like outside editors that they bring in if they're going to promote a story. So my editor would be fine with some stuff, and then I'd check an article and it would be completely reworded if it made it like to the front page or something. Really made me furious, and one of the reasons that I left Bleacher Report, but also money. But yeah, like a good editor is someone who will clean up all your mistakes. Bad editors generally are people who make it sound like it's not you who's written it, and that's what I was really angry about. It was this. It was an Anderson Silva piece, so it was a while ago because Anderson Silva was relevant. Hey, another stab at the Silva lovers. No, it was a while ago. It was an Anderson Silva piece, made it to the front page, and this guy had changed all my wording to be like, he was using phrases like, here's the rub. I've never used the phrase, here's the rub. Here's the rub with that. And I just read it and it looked like someone had rewritten my piece to be their piece. It was really strange. I mean, my name was still on it, obviously, but it just hacked me off. And so, yeah, I mean, you probably don't need telling this. I mean, if you're an experienced editor, but that is the thing that all writers hate. If they've made a choice to word something like that, if it's clunky as fuck, highlight it to them and say it's clunky as fuck. Don't just change all their phrases so that it doesn't sound like them. In terms of finding people, well, I mean, it sounds like you're an experienced editor. You've been working in the academic press, so just approach like the guys from, MMA Junkie, MMA Fighting, places like that. They'll all be happy to look at the resume of a decent editor. Don't know if that's much help, but thanks for the email, and thank you for the awesome picture, Andrew. Hey Jacques, spelt Frenchly. Just like good God, yeah. Yeah, no, it does start like that. I thought that was a weird way to start. Just like good guard passes all share the same habits, such as control of the opponent's hips, combo left side passes with right side passes, and deny their opponent any posts. What habits do all good jabbers share? What are the most important points of the application of the jab? What are the most important applications of the jab? Finally, who are the best jabbers you would recommend one study? Cheers, Chad. It's like boxing, like when people used to ask who's the best boxer in MMA in around 2012, and I'd go, oh, for fuck's sake, it's not a thing. Like, you want me to say this guy, but what you mean is he's got good combinations, his feet are awful. Like JDS, best hands in the heavyweight division, terrible footwork. Nick Diaz, beautiful combinations, great body shots, terrible footwork. And then there's guys with great footwork and can't put a combination together to save their life. There are so many skills involved in being a good boxer that, and this is to a lesser extent, this is true with jabs. But I would say one of the things that good jabbers have in common is feinting, because the whole point of the jab is getting maximum reactions out of minimal effort, or maximum damage out of minimal effort if they aren't reacting. Change of dynamic would be more important, forte and piano, or piano forte. You gotta, sometimes you want to smash a guy with like a massive jab. Sometimes you just want to flick his eye, and that's a really important point that you'll notice in really good jabbers. Muhammad Ali backhanded most of his jabs, but if he wanted to, he could step in and slam a jab into your head. There's this thing where you either have to be like a ramrod jabber or a flicking jabber, and the best jabbers are the guys who can do both. And aim, I would say, is very important too. You're not just trying to jab them in the face, you're aiming for the eye. The nose to a degree, but a nose, it's quite hard to break. You've got to drop a right hand on that. But try and get the eye all the time. If you can touch someone's eye, with your hand several times in a fight with some force, it'll close up. If you're punching them in the eye, it's going to close up a lot quicker. And I would say, for me, ability to build off the jab is what makes a good jabber. There are 1,000 ways to consider the jab. Like Jim Driscoll and people like that were writing about how the jab is the only weapon and you should be pounding this guy with the jab. And it was, the straight jolt or the lead or whatever. But I've always thought the what's it called? The jab is the table setter was the old phrase. But, you're setting stuff up. The fact that he doesn't want to keep taking this jab on his swelling eye is going to open him up to other things. And the other thing is level changes. I mean, you can't flick a jab to the body, so you do have to be able to jab hard to jab to the body. But guys who can jab to the body and the chest, the solar plexus, even the gut, guys who can go up and down with the jab have a lot more success than guys who just jab for the head every time. So, dynamic, level, aim, and follow-ups would be the common factors in a very good use of the jab, I would say. Cheers, Chad. Wow, we're over time, and I didn't think I'd do that on a show when we weren't recapping any fights. But let's have a look at this fight card this weekend. Dat Boy Choi, or the Choi Boy, Soy Boy Choi, he's fighting Jeremy Stephens. It is the first visit to St. Louis, Missouri, which I suppose is a big deal. By the UFC, that is. Strikeforce apparently used to hold some events in St. Louis. Anyway, you've got Jeremy Stephens versus Do Ho Choi. I highly recommend checking out the article that's going up today about that. Do Ho Choi throws himself off balance with almost every right-hand counter he throws, so feints would be a huge deal for Jeremy Stevenson. I'd love to see him flick out the jab and duck in and then hammer the body. He has good body shots, doesn't really use his jab as much as he should. But just like Do Ho Choi, in some respects, very interesting matchup for Jeremy Stephens because he doesn't really move laterally, he doesn't avoid engagements. He's there waiting to time his right hand and doesn't really show much else, or occasionally a jumping knee or some shit. Uriah Hall versus Vitor Belfort. I mean, this is feeding Uriah Hall a finish because he is such a brilliant athlete and technician, but dreadful at actually getting the finishes and getting the fights done. He's a guy who has all kinds of problems. And he's another guy with a 84-inch reach or whatever it is. Decent jab, doesn't really build off it at all, and has just seemed a little bit slow on firing the gun in the past, whereas Vitor Belfort will come out and try and hit him immediately, but has no chin and will fade immediately too. Not a great fight. Really seems like they just want to give Uriah Hall a win, which I'm guessing is why Vitor Belfort's not in Brazil. But didn't Gastelum knock him out in Brazil? Anyway, Paige Van Zandt versus Jessica Rose Clark. Meh. If Paige Van Zandt wins, expect a title shot. Kamaru Usman versus Emil Weber Meek. I like Meek. I enjoyed that fight with Mean. He's looking a lot trimmer than in the fight with Pelhares. Like, that is markedly different if you want to check that out. I know he was injured for a while, but it's very marked. Or marked, whatever. Kamaru Usman, mainly a wrestle grinder, if I remember, but picked up a really good knockout in his last fight, I seem to recall. Darren Elkins versus Michael Johnson. Now, that's a sleeper there. Why'd they put that on the... Oh, it's on the prelims. Oh, no, both the main card and the prelims are on Fox Sports 1, so really no difference at all. But you got the Damage with the worst tattoo in MMA against Michael Johnson. Johnson, I really wanted to do like a boy watch or something on him, because he's just such a specialist. He's got like 3 things he does, and he does them really well, and they're enough to trouble most people. Like, very good straight hitting, very good low kicks, very good lateral movement, and a lovely left straight to the body. And against guys like Tony Ferguson, that was more than enough to carry the decision. He wins fights on a very limited skill set, but he does it very, very well. James Krause versus Alex White. Okay, I like James Krause, mainly because he was front kicking before anyone was front kicking. Matt Frevola versus Marco Polo Hayes. Thiago Alves versus Zach Cummings. Jessica Eyes on the card. Maybe she'll get a win at last. Danielle Taylor, the woman with the biggest thighs of anyone in any division I've ever seen. She could make, she is a strawweight. She could definitely make atomweight if she didn't have thighs. Yeah, not a particularly good card, but I'm sure there'll be some good fights on it. Oh, wow, Danielle Taylor beat Jessica Penne. Did not know that. But she's 5 foot even. Wow, okay, that's a real height disparity. I'm going to have to watch that fight now, just to see how that went. Actually, didn't Jessica Penne test positive the other day? And someone was like, 1-4 in her last 5 and tested positive. Time to cut her. And I was like, Ann Anderson Silva, mate. Anyway, I reckon that'll do us for this week. If you aren't a Patreon boy, sign up to the Patreon. If you aren't bookmarked, I don't know. If you aren't checking out the Fight Primer on the regular, get to it, because we're doing our matchmaker pieces and we're doing our prospect watch, and I'm really proud of that. And if you haven't bought the book, buy the book. I'm your boy, Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Gone By podcast, episode 64. And I'll catch you next week. Cheers. Connor bless.